Horses are beautiful, majestic animals. Their grace combined with power make them excellent subjects for drawing. And in this lesson, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to draw a horse with charcoal on gray paper. Hello there everyone, Matt here with thevirtualinstructor.com, and in this lesson we're going to take a look at drawing a horse using white and black charcoal on gray charcoal drawing paper. Now in this lesson we'll use the grid technique to ensure accuracy, but we'll also take an approach that's a little bit more of a painterly approach to drawing, which is suitable of course for charcoal. Now, before we get into the lesson, I'd like to remind you, if you're new to the channel or if you haven't done so yet, why not subscribe? Go ahead and push that subscribe button and also push that notification bell so you're updated or you're notified every time we upload a new video. And of course, if you like this video, make sure that you give it a like. We also have a program over at thevirtualinstructor.com that includes a variety of drawing and painting courses. You can check out 3 of our course videos and ebooks for free. There's a link in the description below, so you can go check that out, of course. All right, with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into this one. We're going to start by taking a look at the materials. Now, for this lesson, we're going to be working on gray charcoal paper. Now, charcoal paper is an interesting paper. It features a laid pattern, so it does have a little bit of a texture associated with it. It's a relatively thin paper, but it's designed in a way that you can apply the charcoal and it holds the charcoal in place, so it's going to be a little bit less powdery than if you were working on traditional regular drawing paper. We're going to use a variety of different forms of charcoal for this drawing. We're going to use vine charcoal, compressed charcoal, and also white charcoal. We'll also be using a kneaded eraser, and the kneaded eraser is going to act not only as an eraser, but also as somewhat of a mark-making tool as well. Now, I mentioned there are different forms of charcoal we're going to be using. We're going to start off with vine charcoal. Vine charcoal is a softer form of charcoal. It's easily erased, and it's very brittle, so it's easy to break as well. Then we're going to progress on to adding compressed charcoal. Compressed charcoal is considerably darker than vine charcoal. It's not as easy to erase, so it's better suited for finishing touches and details. We'll be using compressed charcoal in both the pencil form and in stick form. We'll also be adding lighter values using white charcoal. Now, white charcoal comes in pencil form and also stick form, and we'll be using both of those forms in order to complete the drawing. All right, now that we've had a look at the materials, let's go ahead and dive into the drawing process. So we'll begin here on the gray charcoal paper using a bit of vine charcoal to sketch out our subject. Now, a couple of things here. First of all, you'll notice that I'm using the grid technique to draw the subject onto the surface. I've taken the image and, of course, superimposed a grid over the top of it using Photoshop. And then on my drawing paper, I've created a corresponding grid. So the same number of squares exist in both the photo reference and on the drawing surface. Therefore, I can just basically take each square at a time, thinking about each square as basically being its own little drawing. Now, of course, we're going to create the drawing in totality. We're going to tackle individual sections once we get the basic subject in place on the drawing surface. But for now, we're just concentrating on the information that we see in each one of the squares. Now you might notice that the lines that I drew on the charcoal paper are white instead of what you might expect with like graphite, which would be a gray line. I used white charcoal for this so that I could see the lines, of course, so they could contrast against the gray background, but also so that they didn't interact with the charcoal. Sometimes when we make grid lines with graphite, we have the tendency to put too much pressure on the pencil, which leaves grooves or small indentations in the surface of the paper, and this would be visible with our softer charcoal applications. So by using the white charcoal, it's easily erased, and of course, it works with the medium that we're using to finish the drawing. Now, the charcoal that I'm using here, again, is vine charcoal. This is the softest form of charcoal. It's easily smeared, and it's very easy to fix your mistakes. Now, vine charcoal is typically round, and in this case, I've found a piece of vine charcoal that fits into my pencil extender here. So I initially sharpened the tip of the vine charcoal using a little sanding pad and then just placed it into the pencil holder. And I like to do that when I'm sketching out at least the contours or the basic sketch of the subject when I'm doing a charcoal drawing like this. Now you'll also notice that I'm going back in with a kneaded eraser. Of course, as I mentioned before, the vine charcoal is extremely easy to erase, so we can just lift up the graphite where we see fit. Now, you'll also notice that I'm not just drawing lines here, I am putting some information about the value on the surface. And again, we have this freedom when we work with charcoal. I'm using my finger to blend as well. This is creating a variety of different grays on the surface. So I'm not just thinking about the linear information that I'm observing, but also the value information that I'm observing as well. Now you'll notice throughout this process that I'll return to different areas. In this case, I'm returning back to the upper portion of the head with the kneaded eraser and lifting up some of the charcoal to make a slightly lighter value. Now, charcoal is an interesting medium. It's clearly a drawing medium. As you can see, we're applying the material dry to the surface, but it's also very related to painting. Now, what I mean by this is with a painting medium, like acrylics, for example, we generally layer applications to build up depth in the color and to build the value range in the painting. And with charcoal, we're essentially going to do the same thing. You can see this initial sketch here is very, very loose, but we're going to continue to refine the drawing by adding more of the charcoal material to the surface and also removing it with the eraser, as you can see here. So essentially, we can think of this initial sketch with the vine charcoal as being somewhat as an underpainting in which we're going to apply more applications over the top and refine the drawing as we go through the process, much like we would a painting. Now, with a graphite drawing, you can do this to a certain degree, but it's a little bit more difficult to approach a graphite drawing in this way. With colored pencils, of course, we're layering the applications, but colored pencils aren't nearly as forgiving as charcoal. So this is where charcoal differs from some of the other drawing mediums that you might be accustomed to. Now, charcoal also is very interesting because it has a little bit of a relation to sculpting with clay. Now, hear me out here. When we sculpt with clay, we typically start with maybe a ball of clay, and then we start manipulating it with our hands and our fingers. And the more we manipulate that ball of clay, the more it becomes whatever sculpture we're trying to construct. This is true for charcoal as well. We're starting with looser applications, but the more we alter it, and the more we add to it, the more we subtract to it, the more it becomes the drawing that we want it to be. So charcoal is very malleable, and that makes it interesting and unique in the world of art. And that's why charcoal is such a wonderful medium for learning how to draw, and especially for transitioning into painting. A lot of people approach me and tell me that they just want to learn how to paint, and they're not interested in learning how to draw. The reality is that painting is basically a form of drawing. You're just using a wet medium and applying it to the surface instead of using a dry medium and applying it to the surface. So drawing is foundational to painting as well. And if you're really interested only in painting, then you probably need to start with charcoal because it's going to transition nicely into painting, especially for those opaque painting mediums like oils and acrylics. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm not just drawing the contour lines here in the early stages of this drawing, but I'm also thinking about the value. Value is the darkness or lightness of a color. It's how we understand the world around us. It's how we understand textures and forms and obviously the light within the scene. So value is incredibly important. Value is one of the 7 elements of art. Now, in a drawing like this, it's crucial to create a full range of value, meaning we need to have the darkest darks, the lightest lights, and all of the middle values that we observe in between. Charcoal is also a wonderful medium for creating some of those rich darks. With graphite, of course, we always can't get as dark as we'd like to get. That's because graphite is a gray medium. We may be able to get it pretty dark, but we'll never be able to get it as black as charcoal. So charcoal on its own on encourages a full range of value because the blacks are so rich. And in this early stage, you can see even with the vine charcoal, I'm able to produce some very dark darks. Now, in just a moment, we'll switch over to compressed charcoal, which is a lot darker, but of course harder to erase. And that's going to push our value range even further. But even with this vine charcoal, we're producing a fairly wide range of value. Now, of course, charcoal drawings can be created on any surface, any drawing surface at all. And in this case, I'm working on gray charcoal paper. Now, you might be wondering, why are you working on gray paper? Why aren't you working on white paper? Well, an advantage to working on gray paper, obviously, is that we start with a middle value on the value scale. So we start with a value close to the middle in the value scale, and that allows us to push the values both lighter and darker. It helps us make comparisons about the values that we're actually developing on the surface. If we worked on a white surface, all of our values would appear dark, in fact, a little bit darker than they actually are, just simply because of the contrast between the white of the paper and the darkness of the charcoal. Working on a gray surface gives us a more accurate way to measure the values that we've applied. Now you can see I've used the kneaded eraser to erase any of the grid lines and clean up the edges here before we start to get a little bit more refined with the drawing. And since our looser vine sketch of the horse is in place, we're ready to do so. Now, I'm going to start here with a white charcoal pencil, and I'm going to start pulling out some of the lighter values. Now, of course, there are some transition areas here as well, so I'll start to use blending stumps here to help to create those transitions. Now, when I use blending stumps, I like to use one blending stump for the lighter values and one blending stump for the darker values. So you'll notice that I switch blending stumps from time to time, depending on if I want the value to be darker or lighter. Now, we're also going to increase the contrast and also get a little bit more precision with our marks by using a compressed charcoal pencil. Now, this particular pencil is a 4B, so just like with graphite pencils, there are designations on the pencils to give you an idea of how soft and how dark the pencil is. So this 4B pencil we're going to use for the majority of the process here. It's fairly dark. As you can see, the blacks are rather rich. Now, of course, just like with a traditional graphite pencil, we can adjust the amount of pressure that we put on the pencil to produce darker values or lighter values, of course, if we're using the white charcoal pencil. And, of course, we can smooth these applications very easily using the blending stump. Now, I used my finger with the initial applications to smooth some of the applications of the charcoal and to create some transitions and some gray areas. And now I'm mostly going to be using the blending stump to do so, simply because the blending stump is going to give me a little bit more precision since it has a smaller tip, obviously. Now, as we begin to develop the harness around the horse, you'll notice that I'm concentrating on shapes of dark and light. I'm not really thinking so much in terms of, hey, I need to make this strap look like it's leather. Instead, I'm just focusing on what I observe in the reference photo. And this is foundational to creating representational drawings. If we get wrapped up in what we're actually drawing, a lot of times we end up creating drawings that look a little cartoony or fake or artificial. But if we focus in on what we're actually seeing, which is basically just lines, shapes, forms, and textures, then we end up with drawings that ironically look more realistic. And this is because we actually see the world in this abstract way. We see the world as a collection of shapes, lines, colors, textures, and values. And when we create a drawing, this is what we need to replicate on the drawing surface. Now, this pencil may look a little bit different than the one I just used, but it's also a charcoal pencil that has compressed charcoal inside of it. We really want to save the compressed charcoal applications when we're ready to start refining the drawing like we are here. This is why we didn't start off with a compressed charcoal pencil, because compressed charcoal is pretty difficult to erase. You can erase it to a certain degree, but it's not going to lift off the surface like vine charcoal. Now, as I'm starting to develop some of the small hairs on the face of the horse here, you'll notice that I'm making directional strokes that flow along the form of the head of the horse. This means that in this case, on the left side of the head, these strokes are going to be somewhat diagonal, and they're going to curve and change shape depending on the form of the head. Now, I'll eventually start to smooth some of these marks into the surface using the blending stump, but the directional stroking here is important because not only will it help us create the illusion of texture in these locations, but it'll also help to convey the illusion of form to the viewer as well. Here you can see I'm starting to lay some of those white charcoal marks over the top of some of the blending areas, again to create the illusion of texture, but also the illusion of form. Now this horse has quite a hairstyle going on here, so for now we'll go ahead and start applying some of the compressed charcoal up here, but you'll notice throughout the process I continue to return to this area and make refinements. One thing I should mention here as well, I am right-handed, so I'm working predominantly from the upper left-hand portion of the picture plane and slowly working my way down to the lower right-hand portion of the picture plane. This, of course, will help to keep the palm of my hand out of the way of the drawing. As you can see, where I have already laid the palm of my hand, the drawing has become quite smeared. Again, this is partially due to the fact that we applied vine charcoal first. Now, I also have a paper towel underneath the palm of my hand because the smearing would actually be worse without that paper towel underneath. So it's always a good idea to have something underneath the palm of your hand, no matter what medium you're working with, just to ensure that you're not marring the surface as you work. Now I've switched over here to a white charcoal stick. This is a larger area to cover, so it makes sense to use a stick here. This is obviously the white mark in the center of the head. Even with this larger, bulkier tool, I have made directional strokes that flow in the same direction as the hair is growing on the head, again to help to create that illusion of texture, but also the illusion of form. And then I went back here, as you just saw, with a blending stump and worked it into the surface. This creates a variety of different grays, some lighter grays in this section, which of course is what we're observing and of course is more natural. So we're not looking for something that's totally bright white. A few lighter grays, of course, is going to lead to more realism. Now, as you can see, I've used the blending stump on the hair, and I'm using the kneaded eraser at this point to erase away some of the marks there. Again, like I said before, we're going to keep returning to that hairstyle at the top and continue to refine it. Now working on the left side of the head as we slowly progress our way down the face of the horse, you can see I'm starting to add some of the darker values of the right eye, and then over the top of some of those blended areas, again, some of those white marks with the white charcoal pencil. Now I'm putting light pressure on the pencil here to create some very subtle and light grays before blending these applications with the blending stump. Of course, as I mentioned before, the amount of pressure that you place on your pencil is going to affect the intensity of the mark that you make. This may seem obvious, but it is something that still needs to be pointed out. Some people have a little bit of a natural heavier pressure that they put on the pencil, and some people have a natural lighter pressure that they put on the pencil. But just like with colored pencils, the amount of pressure that you place on the pencil is going to affect the intensity of the mark that you make. Now, of course, we're dealing with a variety of different textures in this particular subject. We've got the horse hair, we've got the fur on the body, we also have the texture in the eye, the leather harness, the metal bits, and so on. The texture even changes on the snout of the horse as well. And really, the key to creating the illusion of texture all lies in our use of value. And before I spoke on the importance of value, the relationships of the values that we see are ultimately going to lead to the illusion of texture. Of course, directional stroke making is important. The texture of the paper also plays a role. As you can see, I'm smoothing out some of the applications with the blending stump, but the relationship of the values is a huge factor in creating the illusion of textures that we're after. So that's why it's so important to just pay attention to the shapes of value that you see, the intensities of those values, and of course the values that are around those values, because those also influence the illusion of texture. Now, I also spoke earlier about charcoal and its relationship to painting. And just like with painting, we don't always have to spell out all the details for our viewer. A lot of times, those details are basically filled in by the imagination of the viewer, as long as we have the appropriate values and shapes of values in place in the drawing or painting. And in this case, this is exactly the same case. We don't really have to define all of the details in this drawing. We can, in imply them by, again, positioning the shapes of value that we see. So you can see here in the harness, for example, as I'm working down the neck, adding some of those dark values, you can see some of the value relationships in the harness and the shapes of those harness in the drawing and compare them to the photo reference. And you'll notice that all of the details that we see in the reference aren't included in the drawing. But in the end, those details are going to make sense to our viewer just because we have the relationships of value and the shapes of those values being approximately accurate to what we see in the reference. So we don't have to be spot on with our drawing, and we don't have to define all the details in our drawing. Keep in mind that our viewers are not going to see the reference photo. They're only going to see the drawing. Hopefully, they're only going to see the drawing. And in the end, you're going to be able to create a convincing illusion in your drawing, again, by concentrating on the shapes of value that you see. I know I've spoken a lot about value and the shapes of value, but I cannot express how incredibly important it is to your success when you're creating a drawing. You can see here on the leather piece that comes down from that metal ring. Again, here, another good example of where I'm not adding all of the details that I see, just focusing on the relationships of values. All right, moving on to the snout. This is where we've got obviously a lot of foreshortening. This area comes toward the viewer, so it sticks out. And in order to create this illusion in our drawing, obviously there's some distortion there that we, of course, established with our initial sketch, but also we're going to increase the contrast here. So we're going to have darker values and lighter values here, and we're going to have a little bit more detail shown in this area. And the reason for this is because this section comes towards the viewer, and since it's closer to the viewer, we're going to see more detail. We're going to see more contrast and value. So our darks are going to be a little bit darker, our lights are going to be a little bit lighter. And in a drawing, we can exaggerate this to further create the illusion of space. This, of course, is going to lead to more realism in the drawing, and it's also going to lead to a more interesting drawing as well. Now, throughout this process, you can see how easy it is to basically control the different grays, the different dark values and light values that we create here. If we make an area a little bit too dark, we can always lighten it up, again, using the blending stump, or perhaps by using a little bit of white charcoal over the top and then blending it with the blending stump. So there's lots of ways that we can push the values lighter or darker. And of course, one of the great things of working with charcoal is the white charcoal will cover the black charcoal to a certain degree. Of course, there are some limitations to this, but as you can see, the white charcoal applications do go over the top of the darker charcoal relatively easily. Now you can see after I've added a bit of white and dark charcoal here, I'm using the blending stump again to smooth transitions and work the material into the tooth or texture of the paper. Now, I haven't spoken too much about this particular paper, but you can see that it does have a laid pattern. This raised surface, this textured surface, of course, makes it appropriate for working with a powdery material like charcoal. You can see there's not a lot of dust that's produced, which is what we would likely see on traditional drawing paper or regular drawing paper. With this particular paper, of course, it helps to hold the medium into place. And then, of course, we can blend it to create smooth applications as well. So we have options when it comes to the texture that we want in our final drawing. Now with a sharpened white charcoal pencil, I'm going in and adding a few indications of some of the hairs and also making some of the lightest area in that white section down near the snout a little bit stronger. Again, this is going to encourage a little bit more variety in the value. It'll make some of the subtle grays appear slightly darker, and of course some of the lights a little bit lighter as well. Moving on to the bottom portion of the mouth, we'll go ahead and add some of the darker values here with the charcoal pencil. Again, this is a 4B charcoal pencil. And then, of course, we can work those applications in, creating smoother transitions between some of the darker grays and some of the blacks. Here you can see a very subtle, slightly darker gray here, or slightly lighter gray than the bottom portion of the chin, and how easy it is to create that illusion there with a little bit of the white charcoal. And then again, some stronger highlights here with the white charcoal pencil. Again, going back to that concept of starting with a middle value, working on the gray paper, and then pushing the values outward so that we have a full range, so that we have the lightest lights and the darkest darks and a full range of grays in between. Now we're ready to put some of those finishing details here, at least on the snout. So we're going to pull some strokes out to indicate some of those smaller hairs and whiskers and things. Again, you want to make sure your pencil's nice and sharp for this, but you can see these marks go very easily right over the top of the darkest areas that we've applied that compressed charcoal. And with these little whiskers, it seems like we often need to add more than we think we need to in order to create a realistic appearance. Now there is a strap on the other side of the head. There's not much detail there, so we're just going to fill that in with some of the compressed charcoal and then blend it with the blending stop before adding some of those white whiskers over the top. Now we could leave this as it is on the gray background, but I think that some additional contrast will make this drawing feel a little bit more finished and make it a little bit more aesthetically successful. So we're going to use a bit of white charcoal in the background. You can see I've switched back over to my stick here since we've got to cover a larger area. I start by basically outlining the contours with the white charcoal stick and then quickly filling in the rest of the picture plane. I'm not making a totally solid application here, as you can see specks of the paper showing through, and that's because we're going to use a blending stop to work this in. Once we've got the surface covered, we'll switch over to the blending stop. I'm using a fresh blending stop here that doesn't have any black charcoal on it at all, and I'm using the side of it, basically the broader tip of the blending stop to work the material in. For the refined areas, obviously I'm going to use the tip, but you can see how this leads to a more solid application that's not quite white. It's actually a very light gray, which of course looks a little bit more natural to me. Now we need to refine that hairstyle again. We've continually gone back to that hairstyle, but this time with a sharpened charcoal pencil, we're going to pull out some of those individual hairs here, and it kind of looks like the hair's been crimped. So we're going to have kind of a little bit of a wiggly, squiggly mark pulling these strokes out. And then of course we have a few small whiskers down here. We'll add those with the black charcoal pencil. And now our charcoal drawing of a horse on gray charcoal paper is complete. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you were able to pick up a couple of things here and there. Remember, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. If you want to check out 3 of our course videos and ebooks for free, there's a link in the description below. And of course, if you want to learn more about drawing and painting, we have a program over at thevirtualinstructor.com that's absolutely outstanding. It includes a variety of drawing and painting courses on a variety of subjects and media, and weekly live lessons, which are broadcast each week for an hour and also recorded, which is also part of the membership program. Weekly critiques as part of the Members Minute, and a year-long curriculum for visual arts teachers. If you want to check that out, you can. Everyone starts with a week-long trial for free. There is a link in the description below so you can go check that out. As always, thanks again so much for watching, and I wish you all the very best in your artistic success.